Hello, everyone. So today we are going to be talking about the Jefferson presidency. Let's get to it. So, in the election of 1800, you had essentially Thomas Jefferson representing the Democratic Republicans, and then you have John Adams representing the Federalists. Now, this election was heated, and it was very close, as you can tell by the map here. Federalists had actually attacked Jefferson as a non-Christian whose sympathy for the French Revolution would bring similar bloodshed and chaos to the United States. The Democratic Republicans, they essentially denounced the strong centralization of the central government during Adams' presidency. Remember back to the Alien and Sedition Acts. They also brought forward how that was an attack on individual rights. They talked about the new taxes and the deficit spending. So they talked about all of those things and used that against Adams. This was a dramatic victory for the Democratic Republicans. And so they swept both houses of Congress. And so here you have Jefferson and Burr. They ran on the same ticket as president and vice president, respectively. The Constitution still demanded votes for each individual to be counted separately. Republican candidates for president and vice president actually ended up tied with one another. So by the end of January 1801, Jefferson and Burr tied at 73 electoral votes each. So Adams came in third at 65 votes. So, interestingly, the Federalist Congress at this point would have to make the decision since the newly elected Republicans hadn't taken office yet. Most Federalists actually preferred Burr because he was not as zealous of a Democratic Republican as Jefferson. So, once again, you have Alexander Hamilton, who shaped a very unpredictable outcome. So, this actually sent the final vote to the House of Representatives. So Hamilton helped secure the presidency for Jefferson. He felt that Jefferson was the lesser of two evils. He was a highly influential Federalist at this point, obviously. He mistrusted Jefferson, but he could not stand Burr. He also mistrusted Burr, but he felt that he didn't really exactly know where Burr stood in a lot of things. He knew where Jefferson stood for the most part, but he persuaded the House to vote against Burr, who he called the most unfit man for the office of the president. And this accusation and others led Burr to actually challenge Hamilton to the duel, that led to his death later on in 1804. So 2 weeks before the inauguration, Jefferson won, and Burr was confirmed as his vice president. Now, the 12th Amendment finally sets things straight and requires a separate ballot for president and vice president. So it wasn't like with the previous election where you had a Federalist president with John Adams, and then you had a Democratic Republican vice president with Thomas Jefferson. So it addressed that issue. Now, this election of 1800 is also referred to as the Revolution of 1800. That is the peaceful transfer of power from the Federalists and John Adams, who was the president. He lost this election. So this is the peaceful transfer of power from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans, and it sets yet another precedent of peaceful transfer from one party to another. Okay, so let's talk about some of the key tenets from Jefferson's presidency. First of all, you have that laissez-faire government, that hands-off aspect. He also reduces the size of the army. There was an increase in the size of the army during Adams' administration, and then you have a reduction in tax expenses and a major reduction in the power of the national bank. That was something he wanted to go after. And you also see a major westward expansion. We will talk about that here in a minute. Okay, so Marbury versus Madison, this is something that you went over in depth in civics. So we will go over it, not as in depth, but we will go over it. So in 1803, it was announced for the first time the principle that a court may declare an act of Congress void if it is inconsistent with the Constitution. An act may be declared unconstitutional. So basically, leading up to this, what had happened was William Marbury had actually been appointed a justice of the peace in the District of Columbia in the final hours of the Adams administration, right before John Adams was leaving the office of the president. So James Madison, who was appointed Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, he refused to deliver Marbury's commission, or basically what was making him the Justice of the Peace. So Marbury, joined by 3 other appointees, people who had been put into these positions, they petitioned for what's called a writ of mandamus, which compelled the delivery of these commissions. So the court ruled that the new president, Thomas Jefferson, with his Secretary of State, James Madison, was wrong to prevent William Marbury from taking office as a Justice of the Peace for the District of Columbia. John Marshall argued that the acts of Congress in conflict with the Constitution are not law and therefore are not binding to the courts, and that the judiciary's first responsibility is always 100% to uphold the Constitution. If these laws conflict, the court does bear 100% responsibility for deciding which law applies in the case. So Marbury never received his job, and he was pretty upset about this. So these judges that were put into place right at the very end of the Adams administration, they were known as the midnight judges. So obviously Jefferson and Madison, they had objected to these appointments, and it was what the president at the time, Adams, he had wanted to extend his influence farther, and Jefferson said, yep, absolutely not. So this case leads to the precedent of judicial review, and you need to put a star, underline, highlight beside this is the precedent that the Supreme Court can declare a law unconstitutional. Put a star, underline, highlight. Okay, back to that westward expansion piece from Jefferson. So this is definitely seen as the greatest success of Jefferson's presidency. So this is roughly an 830 square mile tract of land, and it eventually encompasses 15 states. So this is territory that is purchased from France, and this is known as the Louisiana Territory. So Jefferson sent James Monroe and a couple others to hopefully buy it. They didn't know that Napoleon, the leader at the time in France, had already made up his mind to sell it. So Napoleon found that it was too difficult to defend across the ocean, and he needed the money. He sold it in between the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. So he needed the money. It was hard for him to defend with everything else going on. So it was an easy sell for him. So as you can tell, if you look at the map, it doubles the size of the United States overnight. But Jefferson came across a lot of criticism because of it. So it was believed that Jefferson was acting above and beyond his constitutional authority. Because remember, Jefferson was someone who had a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. So he believed that there were specific powers reserved for the president and the executive branch that needed to be spelled out in the Constitution. So the ability to buy property from foreign governments was not among those powers explicitly stated in the Constitution. So the Federalists were quick to jump on this and point it out to him. It was to the point where he actually was trying to put forth an amendment to fix this, but the time, it wouldn't work out with the time. or else they were going to miss that opportunity. So they went ahead and purchased it anyway. So it also put forth a question about how Jefferson wanted small government, and it was giving him a lot of power to negotiate this purchase. So there were also Federalists who were wondering if the United States was funding a war against Spain by buying land from Napoleon. So there were a lot of issues here. However, it did turn out to be an excellent success. So we take a look at some of the pieces of information here. The price for all of this land was just $15 million. That's less than 3 cents per acre. So if you take that into account, that is a ridiculous price. In 1804, Jefferson tasked a man named Meriwether Lewis with exploring these lands west of the Mississippi. And so Lewis chose William Clark as his co-leader for the mission. So the excursion lasted roughly 2 years. And so they confronted harsh weather, unforgiving terrain, treacherous conditions in general, injuries, disease, and also natives who were both hostile and friendly, depending on where you were. So this was about an 8,000-mile journey, and eventually it was considered a success. It brought forth new ecological, social information, geographic, obviously, information. So they collected supplies. They did all kinds of things. They had 45 people that included Lewis and Clark. Also, they brought along soldiers that were unmarried. Obviously, they wouldn't have ties at home. And then they had a Native American guide who would lead them through by the name of Sacagawea. So this would prove that transcontinental travel was possible. So whenever they got back, both Lewis and Clark received double pay and 1,600 acres of land for their efforts. Lewis was made a governor of the Louisiana Territory, and Clark was actually rewarded by being appointed a brigadier general of the militia of the Louisiana Territory. So they, each were well received. Okay, so let's talk briefly about foreign affairs for a little bit. Jefferson does seek neutrality. He keeps that trend going. He seeks neutrality in the conflict between the British and the French. So the British actually start to impress our ships. So this is whenever they seize our ships, they come aboard and they take people from our ships. So one incident that you do need to know of, it's the Chesapeake incident. It's also known as the Chesapeake Leopard incident because the Chesapeake was the American ship and the Leopard was the British ship. So it was one of the main events leading up to the War of 1812, which is our next topic that we're talking about tomorrow. So this was in June of 1807. An American frigate, the Chesapeake, was stopped by the British ship, the Leopard, and their commander demanded the surrender of 4 seamen that were alleged to have deserted from a couple of British ships. And so the American commander refused to give these men up. And so the Leopard, the British ship, decided to open fire. So the American vessel, they had just started a long voyage into the Mediterranean. They were not prepared for battle, and they had just been fired upon multiple times, and they only replied with one gun. The Americans surrendered the vessel, and you have 3 Americans killed and 4 are taken. So this made the Americans so angry. And so it inflamed this vision of patriotism. And so it called a push for war. And so what ends up happening is Jefferson actually goes through what's called the Embargo Act. So what he does is it prohibits exports to overseas ports. And so he cuts off all trade with foreign nations. So he had hoped that it would help the United States by demonstrating to the British and the French that we can depend on our own goods. We do not have to depend on British or French goods. So we are that. Also, we'd be saying that we're neutral. We do not rely on them. We can help ourselves. So you need to respect our neutrality and stop impressing our ships. Instead, it had a devastating effect on American trade. And so, unfortunately, trade ships, they sat rotting in harbors. So, the embargo was a costly failure. It was the biggest mistake of Jefferson's presidency. So exports fell from roughly 108 million in 1807 to 22 million in 1808. That's within a year. Prices fell, shippers suffered, harbors filled with idle ships, and so sailors found themselves jobless. So this was a huge mistake on Jefferson's part. Impressment is already angering Americans. They're already upset about this. So you have the Battle of Tippecanoe. This is where this is fought between American soldiers and Native American warriors. You have William Henry Harrison, future president of the United States, down the road a good bit. He fights against Tecumseh. And this is in basically the heart of central Indiana, what's modern day Indiana at least. So this is following the Treaty of Fort Wayne, which will not be on your test. But that was an agreement that required Indiana tribes to sell 3 million acres of land to the government. And so this chief, Tecumseh, he was a Shawnee chief. And he organized a confederation of Native American tribes to combat this just large amount of pioneers that were flooding through their lands to settle. So this battle ensued, and it ended with the defeat of Tecumseh and the Shawnee at the Battle of Tippecanoe. So it prompted Tecumseh to ally his forces with the British during the War of 1812. So we will see what happens there. So during this time, what's interesting is that the Native Americans, we found out they had British rifles. And so this, with impressment and everything else going on with the British, this pushes what's called a group of war hawks to call for war with Britain. And so this conflict, it started in Jefferson's presidency and it spilled over into Madison's. These are two examples of war hawks. You have John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who we will talk about for almost the rest of this class. And same thing with Henry Clay. We will talk about him for almost the rest of this class, up until the Civil War, basically, for both of them. So these are people that are pushing for war because of the things that we have set up to this point. So we will talk about the War of 1812 next, and that is it for today.